Welcome, my friends, to episode 138 of the Corbett Report, Geoengineering and You. One of the things that the recent debacle in the Gulf of Mexico has reaffirmed is that human activity can have a very negative impact on the environment. And for human activity, please read the activity of heartless, unaccountable, and irresponsible multinationals that are engaging in reckless activities and often doing anything for profit, including subjecting our environment to irreparable harm. And perhaps other good examples of that would be the phosphate fertilizer companies that found a way to take the toxic byproducts of their phosphate fertilizer production process and turn them into a marketable product. Because, of course, if they took their toxic byproduct of their phosphate fertilizer production process and put it directly into the water supply by pumping it into the rivers and estuaries, they would be charged with crimes and they would go to jail for a long time. But if they take that toxic byproduct and sell it to the public water supply systems that then put that into our drinking water supply, we can call it a great public health benefit. And yes, I'm referring to sodium fluoride, which is actually fluorosilicic acid and is absolutely not good for your teeth or anything else and is a horrible toxin. But again, they can put it into the water supply because it's a product, not a toxic chemical. Indeed. Well, there are many other examples, and we see all sorts of things ending up in our environment and in our water supply now, the anti-androgens and the bisphenol A and all of the various other chemicals that are having horrific and deadly and toxic effects on humanity, but all in the name of profit. And of course there's no eugenics agenda going on here, right? Well, we know better than that, and we know that there is a coordinated agenda going on, and it's something that we've looked at this podcast time and time again. But don't worry, for all of those who fear that this is getting out of control, science, as always, has an answer. Because the answer to all of this dumping of toxic chemicals into our environment is not to stop dumping toxic chemicals into our environment, but to dump completely different sets of toxic chemicals into the environment that will offset the other toxic chemicals that are already there. That, my friends, is geoengineering.
Today on Waves of the Future, a closer look at geoengineering. What is geoengineering? Well, geoengineering is something global, intentional, and unnatural. And we've got some smart fellers figuring out new methods. Let's look at a few. Space mirrors! In this lifelike reenactment, Eric is the sun, and Patrick is the Earth. As Patrick orbits Eric, he receives some of Eric's solar radiation, making Patrick very warm. Let's see what Patrick has up his sleeve. By deploying space mirrors, Patrick deflects some of Eric's warming radiation, making himself comfortably cool. Iron near the Galapagos. This is a scale model of the ocean. What you got there, Patrick? Looks to me like a handful of rusty nuts and bolts. Let's see what happens when you fertilize the ocean with that iron. Algae blooms, drinking in that pesky CO2, trapping water in Antarctica. With all that glacial meltwater about, it's all soggy socks. But scientists say we can trap that water in Antarctica. Away with soggy socks. Sulfur in the atmosphere. Patrick here has a handful of sulfur dioxide. When sulfur dioxide condenses, it reflects the sun's warming radiation back into space. Volcanoes! One proposed method of dispensing sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere is by detonating volcanoes.
Well, I'll spare you from the rest of that video, and just as a note to those out in YouTube land, I think the idea of parodying newsreel footage from the 30s was funny once upon a time, but it isn't anymore. But at any rate, suffice it to say that the ideas parodied in that geoengineering clip were in fact all things that have been proposed at one time or another. And we can get some of that from various articles around the net, and here's a particularly good one. From CNET News, November 19th, 2007, Geoengineering, Space Mirror over Greenland? Quote, scientists are starting to consider planet-scale engineering projects to slow the pace of climate change. Anything from causing massive plankton growth in the ocean to putting a giant mirror in space above Greenland to stop ice from melting. These ideas to alter the Earth's environment at large scale, called geoengineering, are increasingly being articulated and seriously evaluated, even though they are likely to be controversial. End quote. And continuing from later on in that article, quote, some efforts led by commercial companies are already going ahead. Planktos and Climos are two companies that intend to seed the ocean with iron to stimulate the growth of plankton. During a plankton bloom, or large-scale growth, plankton metabolize carbon dioxide. End quote. That's right. Scientists are actually, with a straight face, proposing things like dumping iron into the oceans in order to promote algae bloom to save us from the dreaded scourge of global warming and the 0.6 of a degree of Celsius of global warming that has supposedly taken place over the last 130 years. Help us all before it's too late. Yes, well, I think my listeners will be well situated to parse the idea that global warming is an imminent and man-made threat that must be dealt with. But even aside from that, if it makes you at all uncomfortable to think that some of the ideas being proposed to deal with this problem involve mass geoengineering of the Earth, if that makes you uncomfortable, then you're in good company. Because even the ClimateGate scientists are concerned about this idea. Dipping into the ClimateGate email archives, we can find this email from October 14th, 2009 from Kevin Trenberth to ClimateGate guru Tom Wigley. And he writes, quote, hi Tom, how come you do not agree with a statement that says we are nowhere close to knowing where energy is going or whether clouds are changing to make the planet brighter? We are not close to balancing the energy budget. The fact that we cannot account for what is happening in the climate system makes any consideration of geoengineering quite hopeless, as we will never be able to tell if it is successful or not. It is a travesty. End quote. Yes, that's right. There are honest scientists out there that will admit that we are nowhere close to understanding the various processes that are taking place or having an overall energy budget for the Earth that would give us the type of information we would need to begin tinkering and tampering with the environment on a large scale. But there are those scientists who will not be so honest, and at least one of the motivations, as always, would probably be money. And where do they get the money to go ahead with their crazy Dr. Strangelove-ish ideas? Well, how about Bill Gates? Wired.com, January 28, 2010, Bill Gates funds research into climate hacking. Quote, Bill Gates has sunk at least $4.5 million of his personal wealth into geoengineering research. While it's only a small chunk of his vast personal fortune, it's a sign that the founder of Microsoft thinks we should at least be looking into the controversial practice of intentionally altering the Earth's climate on a global scale. Gates views geoengineering as a way to buy time, but it's not a solution to the problem of climate change, Gates spokesperson John Pinette told Science Insider. Bill views this as an important avenue for research, among many others, including new forms of clean energy. End quote. Well, if that loving eugenicist Bill Gates, who spends so much of his personal fortune funding novel ways of sterilizing people in third world countries and brags about the way vaccines will reduce the population, is behind the idea of geoengineering, then it must be a good thing, right? Indeed. Well, unfortunately, Bill Gates is not alone in thinking this is an idea that should be pursued. In fact, there are people in even more influential positions who argue substantially the same thing.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is the one I was referring to a moment ago. We don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means there's always a danger, if you try to engineer the system on a large scale, that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure with the geoengineering in the first place. There are a variety of schemes that have been discussed for geoengineering. A classic example is injecting reflecting particles into Earth orbit that would deflect some of the sunlight that would otherwise be warming the Earth, and in that way try to produce a cooling effect to offset the heating effect of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.